This week we're going to be drawing shadows across the snow as they ride up the bottom of a tree. I've got some interesting subject matter behind me where we can see how the snow kind of meets with the tree at the bottom, how shadows wander up the tree, and then those same shadows kind of traverse the white snow. So I think it's going to be a good subject for us this week. What I'm going to do now is some exercise in composition. Composition means the way that we arrange things in our picture. Typically we work in a rectangle, although there's times when we work in a square. There's also times when we work in a vertical format. And what determines that is our subject, what we want to show. And last week in the PDF file, I touched on composition and presented what we call compositional stems, things that are sort of an armature that can give us a structure, a sort of template almost, if you will. And these templates are based on balance of elements and a way to structure the content. So I'm using a couple of photos here of the same basic scene to maybe illustrate that a little bit. This is the first one, and in this particular scene we have a large tree. In the left-hand side we have a grouping of smaller trees on the right-hand side. And these two elements, they balance each other. One large that's a little closer and a grouping of smaller trees, which we see or we understand as a unit balancing this larger tree. This particular compositional stem is called an inverted steelyard, or a steelyard, where, if you know what a steelyard is, it's a kind of a measure, a balancing scales, and the fulcrum would be in the middle, and then on each side we have an object, and hopefully these objects, even though they're different sizes, different arrangements, they balance each other in the picture. We can even group some of the smaller trees, smaller branches or sticks with this one. So that it creates a tension, but at the same time, within the picture plane, they balance each other. And they can be unified in a number of ways too. Right now there's sort of, the distances are, I would say, a little too much the same from the left of the paper to this group to this group. So a little care in balancing, placing them would be better. They have some strong shadows coming off. I'm just going to draw a little bit of that. These shadows actually connect somewhat. Another strategy when we're composing, arranging, is to find ways to connect things that are similar, whether they're similar in tone or similar in proximity. we can form these connections. These connections, the shadows represent a great opportunity to build some connections in our subject and still keep it harmonious with our idea of the steelyard. And bring this over just a little bit. I think it's a more natural shape. The spacing is a little more natural. A little more to my liking. And we do have some interesting shadows in the foreground too. These do not contribute as much to that initial template or compositional stem of the steelyard, but pictorially they lead us into the painting. They add another means of connecting the foreground with the main subject. And if you didn't know these are shadows and trees, it's a very abstract sort of representation, and that's exactly what the artist is looking for. Shapes that combine to not only describe the subject, but create some interest, create some visual interest. I'm going to shape the snow as it's riding up a little better before I move on. So this started with those two major shapes of this trunk and these groups of trunks, creating a balanced sort of a steelyard. And you can, if you're not familiar with that term, I suggest you look it up so you can see a graphic representation. Maybe I'll try and find one for our PDF file, a steelyard. And we can make this more interesting by putting some distant trees back here. This is one composition. Let's look at another one. This one's a little more complex, but still very interesting. All based on trees with snow and shadows. And basically in these trees, we're looking at the lower part, right? The lower section of the tree for our inspiration. This composition is more based on a sort of Z, where you have these long lines traversing back and forth, carrying us deeper and deeper into the painting. This is a really common compositional stem based on the letter Z. I should mention that even though I'm describing individual compositional stems, often these pictures, they have more than one at work, more than one compositional stem working. It's one, probably one is dominant, one is easy to spot, and that accounts for something, that easy to spot aspect, because when we're in nature there's so much visual confusion, and that's not, I don't mean that in a negative way, it's just there's a lot going on and it's moving and it can be confusing. So if you're accustomed to looking for these sort of structures that we're describing now of compositional stems, this can help you to organize the picture plane very quickly, the composition very quickly, and often give you a really good feeling about what you're working on, a nice center focus, and then the balance that results from all of this is important too. The kind of balance that we project into the scene, that becomes important. And this subject is very good for searching out compositional stems. The subject of trees, landscape in general. So all the way back we have this sort of zigzagging pattern underlying the shadows and the trees. It's broken by some verticals, which is actually great because that creates more tension. And these verticals, if you notice, have interesting spacing. I've talked about this a lot, is trying to find ways to vary the spacing of objects that are similar. This helps us to create depth right away too. Well, let's develop it just a little bit before we move on to the next one, especially down here near the base of the tree. We can start to create some interesting shape, find the interesting shapes that are created. In such a strong light, it can be difficult to see nuance. That's why I'm kind of giving myself a little liberty to create that and not be so strict about following the exact shapes or shading in the photograph. Of course, the photographs were composed, right? I move myself around. We do that all the time to get a better shot. We're arranging and we're cropping and we're looking for balance primarily. This combination of energy or almost imbalance, a sort of tension between imbalance and balance throughout a lot of our scenes. We need balance at the end of the painting, but we don't have to have it at each stage. If that makes sense. It's sort of like the storyline in a good movie. There's lots of up and downs, and at the end, typically there's a sort of resolution. I'll include these photos that I took on this winter day so that you can select, or maybe you have your own photo that you want. But anyway, you'll have a reference to what I'm talking about with composition. And we're going to extend our idea of tonal values today also, dealing with a very strong, brightly lit subject, so there's going to be a lot of contrast. Right, so we get, it's very abstract, and I believe that is something to value, something to actually look for as you're starting your piece, as you're thinking about your composition, looking for that abstract quality that you can use as a foundation in your art piece. And I don't think there's any real formula for that, like it has to be this way or that way, but mostly relying on your sense of balance and taste. Well, now we're getting to some of the details. Nothing wrong with that, but we want to move on. I'm going to show you one more composition before we move on, and I'm going to do one strong shadow. We get to play a lot with shadows today. Getting more and more interesting. Let's move on to one more composition. Also very common and reliable composition. Compositional stem, I should say. And that is the T, or the cross. And knowing this little bit of information, looking at some of those compositional stems from last week's tutorial, when you visit the museum again, you're going to be able to identify these in many of the old masterworks. You can see how they built their paintings based on a triangle. Raphael used the triangle a lot. Based on the cross that we're using now, or the T, based on the L or the Z. And this intersection. I hope you notice and appreciate that, yes, it's an intersection, but it's not exactly in the middle of the picture plane. Slightly off-center creates more of a dynamic quality to the shapes. Slightly off-center. And it's not straight up and down T either. There's a bend to this tree, there's a rise to this horizontal, strong horizontal element. So it's not too graphic, you know, there's a lot of interest in the subtlety or variation. And here we see that nice shadow trailing down. describing the snow, the drifting snow. It won't be too long before we're in the spring season, but for the moment we have snow, and I love it as a subject. So I want you to pay special attention on how the tree meets the snow. And I think there's some interesting lines here we can use coming in the foreground from a tree that we don't see, maybe over here somewhere. Let's extend this a little bit, make it a little more of a panorama. We have a tree up here. So this is another device, another way of creating depth, is showing a tree that's near, mid-ground, and then in the distance, in the background, another tree. This way we create the feeling of depth. But overall, the foundation for this composition resides in the cross. I'll develop this a little bit more because I enjoy these subjects so much, and I feel I'm just getting started here. Before I move on, I want to explore the way the tree meets this snow line. I think it's quite interesting. So my focal point is the bottom of the tree. That's where I have the most contrast. But the drawing itself is held together or given some stability with this compositional stem. I'm going to go just a little higher too. And let's do a little background here. This is still a thumbnail, so I won't go too far with this. But as I find more, naturally I want to explore that, with the pencil. And all of that helps in the final rendition, when you're doing a larger piece. Cross. Okay, let's move on. I'm going to leave it at this state because I could easily spend another hour just working on this small piece. But it's not uncommon for the artist to generate several ideas like this, small, searching for a composition, aware of some compositional stems and how they can arrange their content by zooming in, zooming out, focusing, cropping, and a little bit of rearranging too. These are some slides of the sketches that I made, or the photographs they came from. Here you can see the suspended steelyard as a compositional stem. Also, this is the one that I ended up developing based on a T, or the cross. And the third is based on the letter L, which also serves as a strong compositional stem that we can base our drawing or painting upon. Well, I'm going to draw a little border, doing sort of a panorama today. So my rectangle is going to be a little more pronounced. And we'll start by creating our little bit of horizon. Some loose lines to give me that quality. As long as I keep these lines loose, they're easy to erase, easy to adjust. That's about it. You notice that I'm very cognizant of this sort of gesture of the tree. That's one of the things that attracted me most, and I think it's a good idea to go with that initial attraction. It's going to sustain us through the length of this drawing. So now I'm looking a bit more at the contour. A lot of interest through here. This, by the way, is the Fenway of Boston. So if you go to the Fenway area, Fenway Park is just over here. You can see it in this state right now. Who knows how long that will last, because it's supposed to warm up, but right now you can see it in this wonderful state. And I'm going to start by making sort of a general tone with the flat side of this pencil, soft 6B. Start to get a feel for the subject, the volume of the subject. And using the side in this fashion gives me some speed, as well as it lets me keep the drawing fairly light. In this case, in this subject, we're very aware of the white snow. And we'll use the white of the paper to capture this. Most of the branches that we see back here have a vertical nature, so this particular stroke suits that. Here you can see some of these interlocking edges that create those interesting shapes, the in and out of the reeds. The value of putting in these shadows is we can really show the angle of the light. You notice that as the shadows separate, they assume a slightly different angle. That gives us more clarity, more accuracy with the light. All right, we return to our center of interest. Now putting a little more pressure on the pencil. And I can just follow the gradual bend of this tree. Naturally, by doing this, we start to create a little bit of the bark. Really, I think some of the beauty of these natural objects resides in how they're slightly, I don't know, deformed, or little breaks. This little break in the tree, the way it's curving. Not really a classic shape of a tree, but definitely a tree that's seen, some seasons. Here's that area where we have the snow riding up on the tree, creating a really beautiful edge that transitions into a shadow. So we're bringing this tree to a sort of finish, aren't we? But this is a reliable way to do it. So now we can build, outward from this tree. Towards the background. And I'm going to keep this a little on the lighter side, departing from the photograph a little bit because I want it to recede and create some atmosphere. Eventually we may darken it up, but not at this stage. Just using this flat stroke because it keeps it, plain, simple back there. Here we have some mixture of branches and snow. So I bear down on the pencil a little bit. Anything I can use to capture that softness of the snow, contrasted with the sticks and branches. I'm going to put a slight tone to the sky because I want to set off the snow. I know that it's quite dark, quite blue. And I'm just going to do it very flatly. And hopefully by just doing this light application, we get a little more feeling of the brightness of the snow. We'll count on, I think I'll count on the shadows, the quality of the shadows to finish that, but already that gives us a little more power and suggests we need to go somewhat darker again to the background, especially lower down. By lower down, where the trees are meeting the ground, can be a little darker. This could be misread as foliage, but I'm hoping it translates just into the fine branches of trees in the distance. And I'll put some little stronger lines along the bottom. To get that kind of rolling quality. After doing that too, we can go a little darker in this tree. This section is very complex and it's easy to try and emulate everything. Again, I use that idea of a pattern to help me through this area because it's basically made up of branches, sort of a chaotic mix of branches, and I don't feel compelled to really show all of that or show it with any exact description, but I would like to get sort of the light and dark play because that helps me to describe the light in the scene. starting to come out. Let's put a little more dark here. Kind of reserving that area for my strongest dark. When the shadow comes off the tree, it's quite strong, quite dark. As it moves outward, lighter. You can tell that I'm saving the shadows for last across the foreground. Here's that big tree in the midground, some very small distant trees, creating depth this way. almost there. Again, we don't want to feel like we're copying each shadow, but I am conscious of the width of the mark and the sort of up and down quality. I'm trying to focus on these small little branches and how they cast little shadows, little sharp shadows across the whole scene. Using the side of the pencil helps me keep it soft and sort of at a unique width. I realize there's a lot of choppiness to these shadows because there's some footprints there, but I'm more interested in a smooth flow to it. Very skinny shadows, getting a little darker, you know, as they get closer to their point of origin. And this keeps the edges a little softer. I want to use the hard, firm, sharp edge in places like the shadowed side of this tree. And then counter that with softer edges in the grass, in the distance, in this foreground shadow. Now I have two little skinny trees here, but they don't inspire me. This branch a little bit inspiring, but I'm going to play with the shape, I think. Carry it more like this. Saving that strongest dark for a little texture. In the bark. I think it's a good idea to always save this strongest dark for the final definition, and you should have some location in mind where you're going to use it. We're going to put just a little bit of a gradation in the foreground. Little Z, cross, slightly off center. These are things that I feel make a good composition. I'm going to empty my pencil sharpener. There we go. We're almost there. Yeah, I'm glad I stood up so I can see my work at a distance. I think it's a good idea to do that regularly. And that little bit of gradation in the foreground. I want to use the broad side of this pencil, very wide side, just using the flat end. Gives me the control and sort of a smoothness to it. And I can put a little extra shadow through the foreground. Keeping it very bright back here. My poor lead. These artist pencils are good, but sometimes the leads are very fragile. Blending, blending, blending. For me, this is just a great subject. Really simple and engaging. I love the winter, of course. More than that, I like to see this sort of quiet side of nature, where nature is hibernating a little bit. Let's just darken this a little bit. The flat side of our pencil. We're adjusting now, adjusting. I'm going to step back again. Have a look. Okay. Oh, not too bad. Can I do anything to increase the power of the light? I think return to this area here where we have the bright side of the tree against a sort of growing, I don't know what this is. It looks like it's part of that tree, but it's broken off or anyway, it gives us an opportunity for some more contrast. This pencil has gone the way of being useless because the lead is not strong. Nothing more frustrating. All flat white through here. Here as well, very flat, bright white of the paper. And let's go a little darker in some of these shadows. Yeah, we need to get this last branch, don't we? Okay, I think this is just about right. Well, as right as it's going to be for the moment. Okay, shadows on the snow, the foot of the tree. It's really what I was engaged in, is this big tree, and describing how the shadow snow rides up the bottom of this tree, how the shadow comes off the tree and creates a strong sense of light. Complementary shadows, but they don't overtake the scene, partially because we kept them very soft and narrow, and we put a little bit of a gradation on the snow as well. Good. Let's take a break.